I'll motion. Do I have a second?
Second. Oh.
All right. All those in favor, please raise your hand and say aye. Aye. All those opposed, please do the same. All right, the minutes from the previous meeting have been unanimously approved. Moving on to our first open issue, tax levy presentation. Ms. Crawford.
Yes, so welcome back, everyone. We're gearing up for our start of school. I know we don't have finance committee during the summer, but we are this is our first meeting for the 24-25 school year, and we're going to talk about our tax levy and the setting of our tax levy. As you guys know, it has required to be set before September 1st each year, so we're going to go over it with finance committee tonight, and then we'll have our tax rate hearing next week on the 22nd and for our official tax rate setting for the entire board. So just a couple reminders, we'll kind of walk through our assumptions and what we, the different factors that we have to take into consideration when we are setting our tax rate. We do set our tax rate as required by law by fund. As the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education defines our 4 different funds for our purposes. Fund 1 is our incidental or our operating fund, and Fund 2 is our teacher's fund. But when we talk about our operating fund for the district, we usually lump those 2 funds together as our operating fund. Fund 3 is required to have a separate levy set specifically for our debt services, and that's to repay our general obligation bonds, our debt. And so that is a special calculation that is separate from our operating and then capital projects. We do put some of our tax levy funding and our property taxes toward our capital projects fund as well. So for this purposes, for setting the tax levy, they 1, 2, and 4 are considered operating funds, and then Fund 3 is separate for our debt service fund. Just a reminder for our budget, why this is important. For the 24-25 budget, 63% of our operating budget, again, that is our incidental and our teachers fund together, is from local funding, and 50%, over 50% of that you can see along the right-hand side pulled out. 51% of that comes directly from our property tax revenue, which is why we're here today to talk about our tax rate. And then about 10% of that is Prop C. That also has implications, and that is our sales tax revenue. And so that makes up, there's 1% other in our investment earnings and some other things that are included in our local revenue. But large majority of that funding comes from our property tax and our sales taxes. And then you can see on the left-hand side of your screen there, about right over 30% is state, and then federal and other is 5% and less. So we do have a board policy that governs our tax rate as well as state statute, and so our tax rate hearing and review statute does require the adoption of the final tax rate levy annually before September 1st each year. And statute requires at least 1 public hearing to be held after the budget is adopted. Our budget is adopted in June, and so our tax rate hearing that we're going to have will be next Thursday morning at 7:30 a.m. on the 22nd of August. And a reminder that when we calculate the tax levy, it is a calculation that comes from the state auditor's office, but essentially, when we are calculating that levy, the tax rate that's calculated to produce substantially the same revenue as budgeted for and as collected for property tax that was on the rolls in the previous year. So that means existing property that was on the rolls last year that are still on the rolls this year, we are capped at a certain increase, and so they can't increase, so they don't want above a certain amount of additional revenue. When we talk about the same property. But then we have new construction, which we look at separately, and that's property that was not on the books last year. That is new construction that has been built that is on the books for the current year. And a reminder also, a couple years ago, we had this court case that came out that reduced our tax rate, and we'll kind of have some correlation with this, so I just kind of wanted to walk through a couple reminders. Again, the Blankenship versus Franklin County decision. This was a court case between a taxpayer and a county collector in a school district that ruled that it was unconstitutional to the extent that it raises the rate above the voter-approved rate. And we'll actually see where that comes into consideration a little later in our presentation. but we did have to adjust our levy in 2021, which reduced our levy by over 32 cents. And so that was a permanent reduction, not just for that year, but then going forward, that tax rate ceiling was lowered by that amount. And so it's reduced again every year going forward. And so the only way to recoup or get back up to that 32 cents that was reduced would be to go to the voters for an additional levy in future years.
Heather, just for the sake of clarity, that was a levy that had been approved by the voters.
Correct. And so there was nothing that we did when we calculated it in previous years, but the way the state auditor's office allowed us to do the calculation, it allowed you to go above what the voter, depending on, and actually you'll see this tonight because as we go through, if there is a decrease in your assessed valuation, the way to recoup some of those revenues up is to increase the tax rate to keep the same amount of tax revenues that are on the book. Well, now we're not allowed to do that because we can't go back above what the voters have increased. But in previous years, because now that that's unconstitutional, that ceiling is always going to be what the voters approved, and so we're not above that. And again, that 32 cents, and as you'll see on this next slide, how that correlates to the last tax levy that was approved. We approved 65 cents in the 2016. That was a voter-approved levy when we went to the voters. And so this was when we went to pass that levy. This is how it was promoted, the breakdown of how those funds would be used. And so essentially, that it was supposed to make an additional $16 million in revenues from that 65 cents. Well, because of the reduction in revenues due to the blankenship, 32 cents, that is essentially half of the 65 cents that was authorized. And so the revenues, again, that would need to be able to, we'd have to go to get that additional 32 cents. The only way would be to have an additional authorization by the voters in future years.
Is that under consideration?
It is. So eventually, because we've been very fortunate in the last few years coming out of COVID, that we have had that the revenues and our assessed valuation, and specifically our personal property taxes, have been higher than what we had essentially budgeted to begin with. And so some of those revenues that we have been able to put into fund balance, and so that has delayed the need for a tax levy in future years. But eventually, based on our 5-year model going forward, there will be deficit spending in the future, and that is not a model that you can sustain forever. So we will eventually need to go to the voters or have additional revenue to bring in to be able to make up that deficit going forward. So there's several considerations that we have to take into consideration when computing the tax rate. So the number one is our assessed valuation. And so we get our preliminary assessed valuation from the county at the end of July. And so we look at what our assessed valuation was last year and the increase between the 2 year or decrease, as we'll see on the future slide. Our Prop C, Proposition C is our sales tax, and we do not have a waiver. We are one of the few handful of districts in the state that does not have a full or partial waiver of the Prop C rollback requirement. And so we still have to take that into consideration here in Columbia when we're computing our tax rate each year. And then our debt, again, our debt service levy is allowable, and that's separate from our operating levy. And so the revenues that are needed to be able to repay our principal and interest payment on our debt, which is going to relate to our second topic tonight. So we've had our really healthy fund balance in our debt service fund because we've been able to refund some bonds, and so the amount we do voluntarily roll back some of what is allowable per statute and what we actually need for our debt service levy, and then any Hancock Amendment considerations. So first we'll talk about the debt service levy since it is separate. So our debt service calculation, again, our allowable debt service levy per the state auditor's calculation. Again, the forms are downloaded from the state auditor's office. We receive the calculation and it's based on our principal and interest payments and what we owe on our debt for the next couple years. And so we enter in all of that information and they tell us what our allowable ceiling is for our debt service calculation. But because we have a long-term plan and we've been able to, again, have a healthy balance in our debt service fund, we do voluntarily roll back a partial of that, because the last time we went for a debt service levy increase was in 2012, and we made a promise that as we are taking out additional debt and having continued our long-term capital financing plan, that we are able to work within that 0.9719. And so even though they say we can have the allowable debt service fund levy is above that amount, we have maintained that maximum and that we don't take out an additional debt that's above that, and so we can continue to work within those revenues at the 0.9719, that the revenues that we're bringing in for property taxes and our debt service fund. And so that's what we're recommending again for the 24-25 school year, to keep that debt service calculation at 0.9719.
And so this is not a further reduction compared to what we did last year.
Correct.
It's just a continuation of the tax cut that we've been doing.
Yes, and so since 2012, our debt service levy has been at 0.9719, even though it's been allowable every year. We voluntarily rolled that back so that it stays at that amount. And switching back over to our operating fund, let's talk about Proposition C. Again, this is a statutory rollback, and the only way to not have to do this would be to go to the voters to have an authorization for them to waive the Proposition C rollback requirement. Proposition C, again, is a state sales tax, and that's dedicated to education, which was approved by our Missouri voters back in 1982. And essentially, we reduce our property tax rate by increase to about 1/2 of the Prop C revenues received and maintained in the district. So we take the Prop C revenues, and we'll walk through that calculation on the next slide that we have. So we receive an amount in our Prop C in sales tax revenue in the previous year, and then the following year, then we basically reduce our tax levy by the amount about equal to 1/2 of the sales tax revenue. Again, 95% of Missouri school districts have a full or partial waiver of Proposition C, but Columbia does not.
I guess the theory on that is that they're paying, the citizens of the district are paying that money already through the Prop C sales tax, so we can't tax them the same rate
Yes.
to overfund.
Yes, so that's exactly right. So the reason why the rollback was initially created was to encourage people to go out and spend money and buy stuff, and then so they're being charged in sales taxes. And so if you go out and you buy them, then we will reduce your property taxes by a certain amount because to encourage you to spend money through sales tax.
So the more events we bring to Missouri, the less taxes, people's personal property tax get hit.
Right. So this is the Proposition C rollback calculation that we go to. Again, we're considering our prior year receipts, and just a reminder, like the number that you're seeing there for 24-25 right now is an estimate, because we are accrual basis. We are really only a handful of districts in the state of Missouri that do full accrual accounting, and so that means that when they're collected, the sales taxes that are collected in June are not turned over to the district until August. And so that will come on our August DESI payment, which usually comes about the 20th. And so we haven't made it to that date yet. So this is actually an estimate. So these numbers may change slightly between tonight and the actual tax rate hearing that happens next week, because we'll have the final numbers by that time. But this is, again, an estimate. And you can see, and you've heard me talk about this over the last several years, our sales taxes have remained strong. You can see increasing over the last 4 years from 20 million, right over 20.2 million in 21-22 school year, and then up to almost 27 million for the 24-25 school year. So that's been a substantial increase. We have the last few years had additional allocations and sales tax that have come in late in the year. And so we do expect that to happen again because the legislature had approved an additional money that came in through sales taxes last year. And so then you have half of the total Prop C revenue on the rollback. And so half of that 26.85 million you see is the 13 million. And there is, when this law went into effect, there is some adjustments that are made because of some apartments that went from commercial to residential, and also because of our state railroad and utility taxes that are in there. So we reduced that 13.5 million to 12 million, but still, again, 12 million, a significant number to reduce our levy. So we're reducing it by that. And so then we have to take our assessed valuation, which our assessed valuation at the time right now, our preliminary assessed valuation right over 3 billion. You can see there for 25, 3 billion and 23 million dollars. And then so that once you do the divide out those numbers to get the number to roll back on the tax levy. And so how that $12 million correlates to cents on the tax levy is a 0.3541 cents to roll back our total levy to be able to reduce it by that $12 million. And again, it does vary slightly from year to year based on the total sales tax that is coming in, but you can see really only very little difference between last year's rollback on our levy to the current year. It usually is right in that 30, above the 30-cent range, so 33.6 last year over 35.41 again this year. And so now we want to look at our assessed valuation components. And so there's again, we talked about new construction. So those are properties that were on the books or not on the books last year that are on the books this year. And we get that information from the county separately of our new construction amount. So by statute, all new tax revenue from new construction improvements on personal property is collectible by the school district each year. Reassessment typically does occur every 2 years, and so this is not a reassessment year. Last year was a reassessment year, so there is not a reassessment occurring for this year, for the calendar year 2024. And we do have a couple what we call TIF or tax increment financing properties, and so those are what are deducted out of our total assessed valuation. The $3,447,000 is deducted from our that we are not included when we're calculating our tax rate. And then under the Hancock Amendment, growth in existing value again on the books between last year is capped at CPI or the statutory maximum of 5%. Our consumer price index is 3.4% for the current year. And again, that information comes from the state auditor's office. And however, as we're going to walk through, the permitted growth on the books, actually, we could receive up to that 3.4. However, our assessed valuation is actually lower because of the personal property tax amounts that you're going to see on the slide of the breakdown between our real estate and property tax. We've talked about the last couple of years. 2 years ago, we had a very large increase in our personal property tax between 20 and 25%. That our personal property tax number increased, or we're going to see a significant decrease this year, which is then the overall, it's driving the overall decrease in our overall assessed valuation. So again, we could have taken up to 3.4%, but because our assessed valuation is decreasing, it actually is a moot point for this year. And so this is what our assessed valuation summary looks like. You can see our total assessed valuation, our final for calendar year, again, 2023. We received in December $3,228,000,000, and again we would back out our TIF properties to get that $3,224.8 billion there for our total value. And so our preliminary for calendar year 2024 that we just received is, you can see, less than that at $3,197,000,000. And so you can see then that is a increase or actual decrease in our assessed valuation. So that's why I put it in red in parentheses there. It's almost a 1% decrease in our assessed valuation between last year and this year. Again, and that amount that is certified, if we didn't have that additional amount, $40 million was actually an increase of new construction and improvements that wasn't even existing on the books last year. And so you could see that 40 million, if that 40 million wasn't in there, it would be a decrease of about 70 million between last year without the new construction. So it would be even a larger decrease if that we didn't have any of that new construction number in there. So the next slide, I have the breakdown between like the real estate, so you can see the different categories. Again, what we predicted was about a 2% increase in our real estate, which you can see each one of our real estate lines, our residential, agricultural, and commercial did increase slightly between the final 23-24 numbers and our preliminary 24-25 numbers. But again, it's that personal property line there that is driving that large decrease. So you can see a $75 million decrease in personal property between last year, calendar year 24 or 23, and then the current calendar year of 24. So you can see then that is our total assessed valuation difference, because we did have an increase in real estate, decrease in personal property tax. So our net assessed valuation decrease is that $30,264,000 number that you see there. And again, you can see that the next line, as you work down through there, our percentage increase or decrease, that's why we have it in parentheses there, because about 0.94, almost a 1% decrease in our preliminary numbers between last year. And so you can see that we did have a large, because last year was a reassessment year. And the fortunate thing is that we did come in over budget last year. And so we've talked a lot about fund balance and how that affects it. But as we put that additional money into fund balance, so when things like this, and we project out in 5 years, so there's nothing urgent that has to be done today. But again, because it came in over budget last year, again, under budget this year, but our total assessed valuation that you can see there is quite a significant difference between last year and this year.
Heather, from my memory, wasn't a large part of the 6.6% increase last year the blip in personal assessments?
So there was some, but 2 years ago was the really large.
That's when it shot up.
Yes, and personal property tax. Last year, a lot of it was because it was a reassessment year. The previous year was when the 20% increase in personal did increase still quite a bit last year, but it wasn't like the same amount that it increased the previous year.
So in essence, we're seeing the COVID bubble of values on cars work its way through.
Yes, correct. Okay, so then we have our assessed valuation, and we have taken into consideration our Prop C numbers, and so then we have all that information that we have gathered, and so then you have to take that into when we're actually calculating our operating tax levy calculation. And you can see we start out at the top, and so we're for 24-25 is all the way on the right-hand column there. We start out with the prior tax rate ceiling at 5.0367, and again, we don't have any voluntary rollbacks that we haven't taken yet, so we come down and we still have that same number. And then the maximum operating levy authorized by the voters, remember we talked about this, that's statutorily we cannot go above that amount, so we have 5.1437. Again, our tax rate ceiling, which happens to be above that amount, again, we cannot go up to that amount. So that tax at 5.3877 on the state auditor's office calculation, but because that Blankenship ruling where we cannot go above that amount, even though we have a decrease in our assessed valuation, we still cannot go above that maximum operating level authorized by the voters. And so that 5.1437 is our starting point. And so then we have to back out our less required Proposition C rollback amount from the previous slide, which is 0.3541. And so once you subtract that out from from our maximum amount that's authorized by the voters, you get the net recommended amount for 24-25, which is 4.7896. And again, you can see that amount is a little bit larger than it was last year because of the decrease. So the way the calculation works is it does some averages out, some because of our assessed valuation went down, our property tax can go up a little bit again, but not any higher than what has been authorized by the voters. And then here is the breakdown then. Remember, we have to set it by fund, and so we have our incidental and our teachers fund. You can see the proposed, we're keeping the incidental fund flat at 1.4969. Our teacher, we're gonna put that additional revenue, since that's where the large majority of our salaries and benefits are, in our teachers fund, and so we're gonna put that increase into our teachers fund. So that's 3.1927 is the rate there. We'll keep capital projects at the same at 0.1. Again, that's what we have budgeted for, that revenue coming into capital projects. And then our total operating fund levy at 0.47896, which is again slightly higher than last year at 0.0884. Keeping our debt service levy again flat at 0.9719 for a total levy recommendation at 5.7615. And again, the only difference there is in our operating fund, and that's only because of the way the calculation works. Again, not above what is authorized by the voters, but there is a little bit of fluctuation because when you do the calculation because of the assessed valuation difference. And so once we have the levy, then we can multiply out and say, how does that levy with our assessed valuation then affect our actual revenue that's going to come in within our district? And so you can see there, the 23-24, our tax rate was 5.6731. This was what we ended last year at. Our final revenue, all funds, $173,749,000. And so that's where we ended our 23-24 school year. We had budgeted an increase in our property taxes, and so you can see we did not meet that amount. Our new construction was right around, actually pretty close to what we had, right around 40 million. It came in at 248 million. But what the revenue we had budgeted for this current 24-25 school year was right over $179 million. And you can see this as a significant decrease, even with a slight bump in the tax rate because of the decrease in the assessed valuation. You can see there that our revenue is $174.8 million, and that is a $4.2 million decrease over what we had budgeted for the current 24-25 budget. And about 3 million of that is in the operating fund. The rest in our use will show up in debt service and capital projects. And so that amount, again, we're starting out because, again, nothing is not going to affect any of our expenditures that have already been voted. It doesn't affect anyone's salaries. It's just saying this is why we do long-term planning. And when we look at our budget, we budget out in the 5-year model that we don't have to make any kind of urgent decisions today or tomorrow, but just we'll take this into consideration as the beginning of the fiscal year. But it is something as we're working through this year that we'll start. Are expecting our budgeted revenues for property tax to be under what we had originally budgeted them to be. Again, we are in a fortunate situation because our fund balance was above 40%, and that we have the last couple of years, we have banked additional revenues coming out of COVID for property taxes. This is the first year in several years that we have actually come under budget for property tax revenues. But again, it just shows you how sometimes things ebb and flows, and that's why you don't want to, when you do have fund balance, you don't want to spend it all at one time because things like this do happen. But again, we're still in a good situation where we do have that fund balance, and we are all right in the 5-year model.
Blake had a question.
Yes.
I'll let you finish saying before I ask my question.
Oh, go ahead.
So you said that a small bit of the decrease we will see coming out of the debt service levy.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any specific reason why we would not want to, since we could increase that piece, match whatever that decrease is by increasing the levy a little bit there?
We could, but because of, again, and we're gonna talk about more refunding opportunities tonight, that there is no reason, we don't have to, because we don't need that additional debt revenue in our debt service fund right now. If we did, if there was something where we would have a need, we, of course, we would be able to take that additional amount that was authorized if we wanted to, but because right now, we're really we're in a good fortunate situation where we can afford our principal and interest payments, and we're gonna see some possible even savings on what we have for some of our old bonds that we have outstanding tonight too, that we don't need that additional revenue, and we don't wanna just bank revenue and fund balance in that fund either if we don't really need it or foresee an immediate need in future years to need it.
That makes sense, thank you.
Yeah, so, and again, this number, as always, might change between our preliminary assessed valuation and what our final assessed valuation comes in December. You know, we always talk about in January, the first of the year, once we have those final assessed valuation numbers, I'll start really talking about our budget for the following year. We'll look at those final numbers. Typically, property tax, the property tax line is the line that increases between preliminary and final assessed valuation as those different things, as people turn in different things between July and December, so we may see an increase in that. We don't know for sure. Again, we'll continue to watch that throughout the year. And so then the final slide that I always like to talk about is how does this impact the average homeowner? So again, because we're seeing, there was not a reassessment year, the average home is essentially the same as it was last year. So that number, our starting value there at the top, we're not really changing that. And then we have the level of assessment for residential property is 0.19. So you multiply that by the value of your home. So anyone can do this calculation at home. What's the value of their home? Multiply it by 0.19, and then you get an assessed valuation number. And so then you can divide that by 100, and so you get the value on which your property tax is calculated. That number is, so here we have 499, and so then you multiply that out by what our tax rate is. So this year for 24-25 school year is 5.7615, and so you get your annual property tax, and so that should be, so what comes to you in the mail on your real estate taxes should be somewhere around that amount if you multiply that out. And again, just a slight difference between last year and this year because of that increase in the tax rate. So $43, again, for the average homeowner, the impact on your tax statement. And then the last slide, just to show historically, I went back to 2016 since that's the last time we did pass the levy. We're going on, this is the 24, almost next year it'll be 10 years since we last went to the voters for an increase on the tax levy. So when we went to the voters in 2016, we overwhelmingly heard, we want you to ask for everything you need and we don't want you to come back for a while. So that fact that we made it now almost 10 years and we have not had to go back to the voters, and we've worked within the revenue that they authorized, even with the blankenship reduction, is significant. So you can see we did roll back some of that levy in the first year, and that's why that is not, it doesn't say 65 cents on the change, and it was 57 cents, so we rolled back, because we said, we'll take everything you need and then we'll voluntarily roll back for future years. And so 18-19 is when we took that additional, you see, almost 9 cents. And there's small fluctuations because of Prop C rollback differences and those type things in 1920 and 2021. Again, 21-22 school year is when we saw the large decrease because of the blankenship reduction. And then you can see slight differences last year and the year before, and then for the 24-25, again, only 0.0884 difference between the previous year and our tax rate. Again, because without going to the voters, we don't have any significant decreases in those years, or increases. So that's all I had. Do we have questions, comments, suggestions?
Well, yeah, Tom, last year you had a really great thing that you kind of pointed out when it came to inflation and how things kind of increase, and how really, even though there might be increases or decreases, that really most of the time we're not catching up to where that is at. And I just didn't know, I'm kind of putting you on the spot, if you remembered kind of how you said that Because I kind of forgot, but I know that I appreciated that because I know I brought it up last year because I thought it was a really great insight.
Well, I think the discussion was like thinking about the percentage increases in assessed valuations relative to the CPI, the cost of wages going up. And wage inflation is much higher. And so it's gonna create a gap that's gotta be filled if we wanna attract and retain staff.
So we had, I think,
That
yeah.
issue.
Yeah.
And to piggyback on what he was saying, if you talk, even when we had a 5 and 6% increase in our assessed valuation the last couple of years, it was like the CPI was up in the 7-8%. And so that even though we did have, and we were over budget, the increase in our assessed valuation still wasn't as large as what our consumer price index or inflation in layman's terms, what that means. And so, but again, as we were able to, the fortunate thing that we were able to do as we had those increases in our property tax above what we had originally budgeted, we have been able to put some of that back into our salaries. And so we're trying to, again, catch up with those gaps that we see. And we had we're able to put quite a bit of additional money into compensation and new positions and improvements, if you remember back to a lot of our budget discussions that we had last spring.
I kind of want to get you a chalkboard for next week, so when you do that calculation of how people can do it,
Yeah.
and like be like a math teacher, just kind of old school, green board, white chalk. Any questions or comments from everyone else?
No,
Well, thank you, Heather.
great. Again, if we're ready to move on, we do have a second item on our agenda tonight, which is some better news than our decrease in our assessed valuation. This is good news. We have Matt here from Piper Sandler to talk about some potential refunding opportunities for in our debt service fund. And so we have some old bonds back, and there's some attachments in here, and I think we have some handouts. But our plan of finance from our old 2014 and 15 bonds, where we can have some interest savings, and so if we do a possible refunding. And so he's gonna come up and talk. So if you wanna come up here, I'll bring up the attachment here on the screen. I don't know if you wanna just talk through. I'll bring up the summary page so that everyone can see it up here on the screen.
Yeah, the summary page would be great. Yeah, and again, I'm Matt Courtney with Piper Sandler, the district's financial advisor for bond issues. Appreciate everyone's time today to talk about some potential savings on those 2014 and 2015 bonds. So you'll see.
I'm gonna try and make this bigger there too. There.
Yeah, and there is, I apologize, a typo on this. The second bullet point there, it should actually be 37.9 million of outstanding 2015 bonds. So in total, about $41.5 million of bonds outstanding that are either callable now, so refinanceable now, or callable March 1 of 2025. Under federal tax law, you can issue tax-exempt bonds to refinance prior tax-exempt bonds up to 90 days prior to that call date. So we've put together a calendar that would have a refinancing bond issue close on or about December 3rd, and then the proceeds of that bond issue would be placed in escrow to prepay the prior bonds on March 1st of 2025. The average coupon on the bonds that we're looking at refinancing is 4.02%. The estimated rate of refinancing those now is about 3.16. So estimated total savings about 2.8 million between now and 2035. The present value benefit of that is about 2.3 million. But of course, the savings come, each year over time. On that tentative timetable, should the finance committee move to send this refinancing to the full Board of Education, we would have the full board pass what's called a go-to-market resolution on at their September 9th meeting, and that would kind of give us and Gilmore and Bell, the district's bond attorneys, and also staff, that kind of give us the board's permission to move forward with putting the bond documents together, such as the official statement, which is the prospectus that's distributed to the bond market for them to make investment decisions on the district's bonds, along with going through the bond rating process. And we wrap all that up in time to be back before the board at their October 14th meeting, at which time the formal bond resolution would be passed. Then we'd schedule the bond sale on or about October 29th, and we currently plan to use a competitive bond sale, which is the method that the district has used on really most of its financings for the past 10 years or so, where the district will receive bids on or about October 29th and award the bonds to the underwriter that provides the lowest total interest cost. And then following the sale, there's some other procedures that need to be done, like registration at the state auditor's process that would then occur ahead of a closing on or about December 3rd. I did want to make two other points. One is that any savings that we receive, their Fund $3 can't be used for operations. They can only be used within the debt service fund. And the other point I wanted to make is, interest rates do move. This plan does keep you flexible. So, we're showing about 41.5 million of bonds that provide savings right now. If that were to change before October 14th, we would have the ability to drop some maturities that may not provide savings anymore if that were to come. So that's really everything I had, but open for any questions or discussion.
So I don't know how the bond rates for public school bonds are priced.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little surprised that you have this much savings opportunity now. So my assumption would be there are some rate reductions priced into this already.
So if I understand correctly, maybe I'll back up to when these were issued, back in 2014 and 2015. Two things. So at that time, these would have been fairly longer term bonds. General obligation bonds in Missouri can be issued up to 20 years. So the bonds that we would be refinancing would be bonds that matured years 11 through 20,
Right.
around the time they were issued. So they were longer term bonds at the time and in a different interest rate environment back then. Now, as we're issuing them, now we're issuing bonds that mature between years 1 and 10. So they're shorter term bonds now. And also the municipal bond market rates have come down some in the past several months. I know it's hard to tell on that chart because we showed a long-term
Right.
range, but
You're paid to do your best prediction on what's the sweet spot of refinancing these bonds.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously there's a rate and a time component, and I guess what I'm trying to get at is that it feels that the rates 12 to 18 months from now are going to could be potentially lower. And I'm assuming that there's an offset between that and the time savings that you get on that.
yeah, that's a very good point. Could there be more savings 18 months from now?
Yeah.
It's possible. No one really can predict the future. What I will say is the bond market is forward-looking. So, people who buy bonds, they do, listen to the news and everything, and they know that, there is the expectation that, say, the Federal Reserve Board will lower short-term interest rates in the near future. That's the expectation. Nobody knows if it will really happen or not, but where I'm going with that is the market is already pricing in.
Okay, that's where I was
some
trying to
of
get at
that.
the first question. I just didn't state it very well, so, okay.
Yeah, so like I guess I can, as an example, I think the current interest rate expectations are in the packet. But what I was going to point out is you'll notice there's actually some of the interest rates we expect in, say, 25 and 26 are actually higher than.
Yeah, I looked at it.
Yeah. So some of those are actually slightly higher than we expect rates to come in later on in the maturity curve. So But yeah, so that's half of your question. I think the other half of your question was on,
Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah.
sorry. The other half was on, if you wait, in theory, every day that you wait, once you get to the call date, is a day of higher interest you're paying.
Yeah.
So, in theory, if we waited 10 years to call these, you would have already paid all that interest and there'd be no savings, right? So, there is some benefit to refunding bonds sooner, all else equal. But of course, that's all else equal.
Sure.
So,
Are the new bonds fixed to term, or will they have a call date as well?
right, they will have a call date, but it'll be somewhere around 8 or 9 years from issuance. So it'll really only be the last maturity, maybe 2 that will be callable.
So I was gonna, if you can just talk a little bit about for the committee, I know when you guys do the calculation, there's a certain percentage, like if it's, like right now, the net present value, that we're expecting about a 5.5% of refunded par. They usually, when they're looking at these type things for refundings, you try to, if it's over a certain percentage, can you talk about how you?
Yeah, so
determine
that's a good point, Heather. So the GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association, recommends consideration of refundings, not necessarily executing them, but considering them if you have 2 to 3% present value savings or higher. Right now, we're at approximately 5.5%.
So this is considered a prime opportunity then?
Yeah, especially because it's a current refunding, so the bonds will be callable very shortly after we close, and they're at 5.5% present value savings.
And I like that he puts this time, like the little chart down here at the bottom, because we know like the last couple of years how interest rates have rise, but if you really look at long term, like over, you can see like back in 2020, 21, of course, extremely lower than, any time in history really that you could see that. But really, like, we're not, even though we know the last couple of years interest rates have went up, if you look at the historical picture of that, they're still not where they were. Also, the other thing I wanted to note was back in 2014 and 15 when we did these, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, we pushed some of the higher interest maturities were pushed to the end of like when we did it, and so that's why I think we can see some savings on some of these maturities too, because they're not, all the maturities did not have the same interest rates throughout the 20-year term of the bonds.
Yeah, that's correct. On a bond issue, each individual year is really its own bond. So there may be different coupons within an entire bond issue. So I offhand, I don't recall what the coupons were in the years other than what we're showing here. But I can tell you that on the 2015 bonds, there are some bonds with lower coupons that we are leaving out of this refunding because there would be no savings on those.
Heather, is there any more new money issuance that's planned, or do we have all that at this point?
So the next time we plan, everything that has been authorized by the voters has been issued. And so we went to the voters in 2022 and we had a $80 million authorization. And so we had 2 issuances of $40 million. And that most recent $40 million was issued in the spring of this year.
Okay, so you can't piggyback on anything else coming up.
Right. And so we don't expect to go back to the voters until the spring of 2026.
Okay.
And we would not have been able to issue this refinancing with that March issuance this year because we have to wait until closer to that.
I definitely would concur that the 5.5% savings is really, really good. If I were gonna bet money, I think it would be higher if we waited a little bit longer, but I don't think we wanna guess or bet on guesses of interest rates, but if I had to put money on that, I'd probably guess it's gonna go up. But 5.5% is outstanding.
Yeah. And that's, again, that's the unknowable.
Yeah.
If you wait, maybe savings could be better over time, maybe they'd be worse. It's anyone's guess. So we try to kind of follow that GFOA guideline.
But you always have to make your banker dance around predicting rates.
Of course.
It's necessary.
The mechanical question I have is you're anticipating going to market October 29th. That would worry me a little bit. I guess my question is, if there's chaos in the markets around then, because it's gonna be around an election, and we have no idea what's gonna happen. So you won't just blindly go into the market. If there's chaos in the markets, you'll postpone
Correct.
it.
Yeah, we'll track and, yeah, so that October 14th meeting, currently planned bond resolution with parameters. When I say parameters, there'll be a minimum savings level. So the bonds are only authorized if total savings dollars or percentage of X
Okay.
is achieved.
So the board will give you a window.
Yeah.
And then you can execute within the window. You're not just gonna blindly go on this date, no matter what.
Correct.
Okay.
And, yeah, so if the market's bad, around October 29th, we can always push that back. Or,
Okay.
in theory, not issue at all. If
And
rates
when that
really
has
go up.
happened before, a couple years ago, we had a possible refunding and then.
Yeah, we had one that I believe we were trying to complete it, this is probably 2 or 3 years ago. We were trying to complete a refinancing with similar timing to this. The market moved on us. We delayed it. I think we ended up in January, maybe January or February, finally executing it.
Okay.
So yeah, that is something that's happened before.
And I would imagine that we'll probably see you at our October 7th Finance Committee meeting for,
Yeah, happy to, if you guys want us, we can, I or one of my colleagues can certainly come by if you'd like to have that subsequent finance committee meeting, and it will be at the board meetings
Yeah.
yeah.
as well. But
I was
happy to
just,
come
I was
to
just
another-
thinking about, because that next week is where we would be, the board would be adopting those parameters.
Mhm.
And so I just didn't know if that was, if that was planned or not, and it's okay if that wasn't,
I mean, it definitely, if anything, if everything is status quo and everything is still looking the way that we are presenting it tonight, we might not have them, but if something were to change,
Yeah,
then
we're,
either
we're
way,
certainly
good or bad,
available
then
if you guys would
definitely.
like. Again, I don't know what my calendar looks like on that day offhand, but I or one of my colleagues can certainly come by.
oh yeah, I think it might be, yeah, I'll talk with you, because it might be good, even maybe just to tentatively have it, just in case already, and have it on y'all's schedule, and if that's an okay thing of maybe like, we can cancel on you. If it's not really needed. Yeah, and I appreciate that answer to Tom's question, because I was gonna ask you just around like, because it seems like there's always a dip related to an election year, and so I just didn't know how y'all were thinking about
I
that.
would say one caveat to that, 2016.
Yeah.
Very shortly after that election, interest rates went up quite a bit. But that's not a thing that happens after every election necessarily. That's one that I remember off the top of my head.
Any other questions for Matt or for me or the team? Well, we appreciate it as usual for you coming in and spending some time with us tonight.
Yeah, happy to do so, and always nice to have good news. There's potential savings available.
We'll see you on September 9th. Then.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
No problem.
That was our last item for discussion.
It was an action item, so if you
Oh, it
wanna like
was?
recommend that we go ahead, if someone wants to make a recommendation.
So moved.
Second.
Have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please raise your hand and say aye. Aye. All those opposed, please do the same. All right, that is unanimously approved. I did want to just comment on what Heather was sort of sharing as we were talking about where we might go next for a bond or go for a levy. One of the biggest things that's going to really be happening, I feel like this year for this committee and with long-range facilities planning is I've been talking with Ms. Farrar, who's the chair for that one this year, of really looking at this duality of the committees operating together where long-range facilities planning can be the dreamers in the sky of what a 10-year facilities plan would look like when it comes to deferred maintenance or new projects and things like that. And as that continues to kind of flesh out on that committee, if we can then kind of come in and kind of look at where those priorities might be at, how much is our bond capacity, where would be the best timing for a bond question and a tax levy question in tandem with where they're feeling that those priorities are at, so that we really can set up a kind of, they're separate but joint together, kind of a 10-year long-range facilities and long-range financial plan, looking at the district. And so that's kind of the big lift that I feel like we're gonna be doing this year. And it does take kind of waiting for them, for that committee to kind of get to spaces to where we get stuff. But some of the things that we're gonna be talking about in that time is like, really, what does a tax levy look like? Where are we looking at from that? So that once we do get that, we can then kind of think about how does that go with what they're sort of talking around when it comes to bonds and deferred maintenance and any new facilities.
I'm glad you said that too, because that we'll work closely with Matt and his team on that too. So once the long-range facilities team comes up with what projects, then we start packaging some projects and get some scopes and some dollar amounts. Then we work with Matt and his team and Piper to kind of stage out and see like what the cadence is of when would be smart, and how much do we want to ask for, when we want to ask for, and those type things, and the bond and our bond capacity. And again, we want to try tying it back to the tax levy conversation. We really want to try and keep our 10-year, even our capital financing plan within that 0.9719 for our debt service fund as well. And so they can help us with amounts and how we stage those out over the next 10 years to stay within that debt service levy as well.
So we got a fun time, and I might have not prepped y'all when y'all have reapplied, so I appreciate y'all coming and maybe not running after this meeting. And also, thank y'all for reapplying. We're really excited to have you continuing serving with us and working on this. I know that's for all of us as we went and did that, as we were talking around all that, so thank you very much. Are there any questions or other comments that any of y'all would like to make before we adjourn?
I want to thank Heather for the work that she's gone put into this, the diligence, the accuracy, and just, as usual, continuing to keep us on the right pathway. I just want to say thank you for that.
I also want to say thank you again to Ryan and Tom. I know they don't have to do this, it's volunteer work, and for them to continue to put time into this, we really value you guys' input. I think both of you have a great area of expertise in this area and can give great input every time, and we really are glad that you guys are here with us.
Guys, thank you. All right.
So with that, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, we are adjourned.